Hello, everybody. Welcome to Worship the Gathering online. My name is Adam Baker. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm your online host. Grateful that you're here today. I hope that it's really meaningful for you. Now, if you haven't done this yet, I'm inviting you to go ahead and click the subscribe button, turn on the notifications, because it helps you to know when new content is coming your way. We try and release new content, new sermons, new messages very frequently. They're also available on demand throughout the course of the week, so you can go back and revisit, you can share with a friend. All of it's designed to help you and others to grow in your faith. We hope that you'll take part in it. So turn on those notifications, click to subscribe. You'll always know when new information, new content's available to you. Friends, there's also a link in the description to find out more about our church. If you want to find out more about giving to support the ministries of the gathering, there's a link to give there too. And there's also a Connect card that's available. I'd love for you to fill that out because it helps us to know that you're here, that you're worshiping with us. It's really important because this isn't just you on your own. It's not me on my own. We're a part of a community, a church together. That's exciting. It's how we're meant to grow in our faith. We'd love to get you more connected with that community, and filling out that Connect card is that great first step to do so. Now, we have been in our emotional roller coaster sermon series. We've been talking about the different emotions and feelings that Jesus went through during that last week of his life before his crucifixion. We heard about Christ's joy, about Christ's anger, about the sadness that Jesus felt. All of these sound like pretty familiar emotions, right? We're human. Jesus was deeply human. And so I'm excited to find out today what other emotions he might have experienced. It'll help me know. God knows how I feel because God has felt those same things in the person of Jesus. I hope that's comforting for you as well. If you're watching this and it means a lot to you, I hope you'll share with a friend. Maybe you can watch it with somebody you care about, even right now. But I'm grateful you're here. I'm praying for you today. Thanks for being with us in worship.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the gathering. It's so good to have you in worship. It's 3 weeks until Easter, and it will go by like that. And so I really hope that if you haven't done it yet, you'll grab a couple of these cards after worship. And please offer the invitation for someone to join you for Easter. I was just talking to a guy this past week, and he said, Matt, it was 2 years ago that somebody invited us to Easter, and this church has changed our life ever since. And I know that we all know people who are maybe in a spot in life where they're looking for something, maybe they need some hope or just some change in their life. Please invite them to come and join you. It could be an invitation that really does change their relationship with God. So I hope you'll do that. All right, so many years ago in the early days of the gathering, someone connected me to an area pastor. This pastor was doing really good work. He had been doing it for a while. He became something of a mentor, took me under his wing in certain ways, and even invited me to speak at a little conference he was having of some area pastors. And I remember being really excited. It was the first time that anybody had really asked me to speak, so I felt really honored. And in the weeks between when he asked me and when this event was going to happen, I said something or I wrote something about LGBTQ participation here at the gathering. It's something that we have believed in since our founding. And this guy read it, took exception to it. And soon I got an email, and in the email, it disinvited me from speaking at the conference or even attending it. And the email was followed up by a phone call with this guy, and he wanted to make sure I got the email, and he wanted to tell me that he had to distance himself from me. We couldn't connect anymore. In Christianese, this is called a rebuke, and he used that word. I have to rebuke you. And I remember when we hung up the phone, I didn't talk to him for over 2 years, and I hung up the phone. I was just trying to make sense of like what I felt. And I wasn't really surprised. I mean, I've been Christian long enough to know that there are a lot of pastors, Christians who are like this. So I wasn't surprised. I wasn't sad. The truth is I have plenty of friends. I have great pastors and mentors in my life. I didn't need another friend if the guy didn't want that. I didn't feel regret. I mean, I absolutely believed in what I said, so there was no problems there. And I finally pinpointed that what I felt, I think in that moment, was disappointment. I felt disappointment in how a colleague and sort of an emerging friend chose to treat me in that particular situation. And I know that all of us have experienced that. I mean, hopefully you haven't experienced a public rebuke ever, but you know what it's like to be let down by somebody. And the truth is, the closer you are to the person, the more deeply disappointment is felt. I mean, all of us have have had a friend who didn't treat us the way that we hope to be treated. I mean, all of us have had a parent or a child or some family member, do something that really hurt us or felt like a betrayal. I mean, all of us maybe have had somebody that we love, maybe even a partner or a spouse, not react to us in the way that we hope to be reacted to, or notice when we needed something most. I mean, disappointment is just part of what it means to be in relationship with other people. And it's something that all of us can identify with. Today we're continuing our series called Emotional Roller Coaster, the ups and downs of Jesus' last days. And, in this series, as I've been saying all along, we're just looking at the stories, the last week of Jesus' life that lead us up to the cross. And these are really emotional stories. And I mean, I think we see Jesus at his most human. And each week we're just looking at a story and the emotion that Jesus felt. And as we look at how Jesus navigated that emotion, it gives us some real insight into maybe how we're called by God to navigate those emotions in our own life. And today we get to this emotion of disappointment. Jesus was no stranger to disappointment. In fact, throughout his ministry, he experienced it. From religious leaders that he really hoped would be won over to his side, to followers that regularly didn't get it, to his disciples who loved him when he was performing miracles, but then kind of drifted away when things got hard, even to his family who at times, didn't really understand what Jesus was trying to do. I mean, Jesus understood what it was like to be disappointed. But today, I want to read the story of the Last Supper because it's at the Last Supper that I think we see Jesus' disappointment sort of come full circle. It really comes to fruition in the Last Supper. In fact, if you pay attention to the Last Supper, if you read Luke's version of it, for example, I mean, he gives us 3 disappointments right in a row. In fact, it's like nearly everyone around the table that Jesus loved did something in that moment that fell short of what Jesus hoped for. And you had to think Jesus' expectations had to be a little high going into the Last Supper. I mean, the last time he was going to get to be with his friends, he was hoping it would just be a nice meal. How many of you have ever just hoped, can't we have just a nice dinner together? He wanted to impart to them all the wisdom that he thought they needed to know before he was gone. And yet during that supper, the disciples, one by one, really let him down. 3 specific instances. So what I want to do today is I want to look at the 3 ways in which Jesus was disappointed in that moment. And each time Jesus responds with sort of a different tool, a different way of dealing with that disappointment. I think it gives us real insight into maybe how we can navigate that disappointment, especially with people that we care about in our own lives. So if you read Luke's version of the story, one of the first disappointments that Jesus dealt with was a relatively minor one, but it was his disciples obviously not understanding what he was trying to teach them. And it says that they broke out into a fight. And Jesus deals with this first disappointment by clarifying expectations. I'll get to that in just a minute, but let me read to you the argument. The story says that an argument breaks out amongst Jesus' disciples. So there they are sitting around the table. And Luke 22 says this: an argument broke out among the disciples over which one of them should be regarded as the greatest. Now I have to imagine in the midst of this, Jesus knows he's dying the next day. I mean, he hopes these people have learned something over 3 years. And this must have been one of those moments where Jesus was just palm in forehead moment. I've been with these people for 3 years. I have been teaching and preaching and using parables and trying to show them. And after all this time, this is what they think is important. They're arguing about which one of them is the greatest. These people just don't get it. And I have to imagine that Jesus must have thought to himself, after all this time that I've spent with them, I've obviously failed in some way. They still, here they are arguing about who is the greatest. And I know that it would have been really tempting for me to respond to that situation in anger, kind of blowing up at them, and resentment, even accusing them of just not listening, not doing what he wanted and expected them to do. But Jesus doesn't do any of that, the story says. Jesus doesn't react to his disciples in any of these ways. Instead, here's what Luke writes. But Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles rule over their subjects, and those with authority over them are called friends of the people. But that's not the way it will be with you. Instead, the greatest among you must become like a person of lower status, and the leader like a servant." I read this passage this past week, and what I love about it is instead of anger, instead of resentment, instead of blowing up, Jesus, with a lot of grace, simply tells the disciples what he wants and expects of them. He clarifies his expectations of how his followers are supposed to act in the world. In a way, I even imagine Jesus like having the grace to say, maybe I wasn't clear. Maybe the parables were a little too, hard to interpret. Maybe I didn't say it as directly as I could have. And so here Jesus, in a loving way, just directly confronts his disciples, clarifying his expectations and reiterating what he expects of those who want to follow him. And I thought, boy, how many of us could learn from this moment? Taking a step back for a minute, disappointment happens. Like, we know why disappointment happens, right? Disappointment happens when our expectations and reality don't align, right? When you expect one thing, but somebody does another thing. Disappointment happens when we're left with this gap between what is and what we hoped would be, how someone does respond and how we wish they would have responded. And expectations, of course, can be really dangerous because they're oftentimes scripts that we have for how other people will behave, but we often never actually tell the other people what it is that we hope that they will do. And we all have this, right? I mean, you have expectations of what it means to be a friend and how a friend should treat you in certain situations. We have expectations of what a good parent should look like, what they should do and not do. We have expectations of what our spouse or partner should do after a long day at work for us or after a hard day, how they should respond or what they should say. We have expectations of coworkers and how timely they'll get things done and how they respond to us. We have expectations of our pastor and what he or she should say when they're standing up here, or how they should treat us. We all have expectations of people in our lives. But what is often not true is we often are not very clear with other people about what we expect of them. Let me take a common example. This happens all the time in marriages. Like, I remember relatively recently, I was doing, some talking to a couple who was having a difficult time in a marriage. They were dealing with conflict. It was conflict over something relatively minor, but the woman in the relationship, she was really frustrated because she would come home from work after a really long day, and her husband in this particular instance never really seemed to notice. He would kind of go along doing whatever it is that he was doing, and she just wanted him to notice that she had had a hard day, maybe to cook dinner that night or to take extra care of some of the things that had to be done around the house, just recognizing that she had had a hard day. And she was frustrated. She was disappointed that he never did this. And so I asked a really simple question. I said, have you ever told him what you want? And she responded with something that a lot of us have said. I've said this a million times. She said, I don't want to have to tell him. I just want him to know. And I get it. I mean, a lot of us get that. We don't want to have to tell the people that we love how they need to respond to us. We just want them to know. But the problem is that other people don't know. We want people to respond the way that we want. And when they don't, we so quickly move to anger or frustration or resentment or disappointment. But Jesus teaches us something really important here. When it comes to expectations, one of the first things that we can do with disappointment is sort of assume the best about other people and clarify what it is that we want from the people around us in our lives. I mean, there's grace in that. There's grace in assuming that when somebody disappoints us, maybe we weren't clear. Maybe we didn't speak up. Maybe we didn't tell our friends what it is that we hoped from them, or tell our mom or dad how we hoped they would respond, or tell our partner or the person that we love how we hoped they would show up for us. Even at work, we sometimes don't just share with the people that we're working with how we hope to work best together. When we clarify expectations with other people, this gives other people the opportunity to actually understand our expectations and who we want them to be. And so the first way that Jesus teaches us to deal with disappointment, the first way he deals with it is by being really clear, clarifying expectations with the people that are around him. But of course, that doesn't work in every instance. The second disappointment that Jesus would experience would be much bigger. It'd be much more acutely felt. It was maybe the most famous disappointment. It was the disappointment of his friend Judas, who would betray him. And in this instance, Jesus teaches us a second way of dealing with disappointment by practicing acceptance. But first, the story. A lot of you know the story of Judas. He was one of Jesus' disciples and friends. And yet, during the Last Supper, for reasons we don't totally understand, Judas makes this decision to betray Jesus. And Jesus knows this is coming. But still, the moment that he sees Judas make this turn is still a really hard one for him. During the meal, he even looked at Judas, and this is what he said: "Look, my betrayer is with me. His hand is on this table. The Son of Man goes just as it has been determined. But how terrible it is for that person who betrays him." They begin to argue among themselves about which of them could possibly do this. Jesus knew. Now, Judas wasn't just a disciple, he was a leader in the movement. The Gospels say that he oversaw the money. He must have been somebody that Jesus not only cared for, but trusted. He had invested a lot of time in Judas, and he undoubtedly had hopes for the role that Judas would play after he was dead. And yet, in this moment, he sees Judas make this turn. He feels that betrayal. He had to feel just a deep and profound disappointment that this friend, this person that he had trusted, uh, turned him over to the authorities. It can be really hard, I know, to connect with this part of Jesus' story. I mean, after all, not many of us are betrayed by a friend and it leads to our death. But all of us, I think, do have instances in our life about someone that we care about, someone that we even really deeply love, doing something that really hurts us in a way that probably costs us our relationship with them, or at least profoundly changes the way that we understand that other person. And sometimes the closer a person is to us, the deeper that disappointment can hurt us. I remember that this was over 15 years ago, again, in kind of the first year or two of the gathering. I had a really close friend from seminary that we were like best friends during seminary, and he was a pastor. And there were a couple times in those early years that I would invite him to come up to the gathering. He would preach and do some things. And I remember one instance, this was maybe in year one or two of the church, and I noticed that some things in his life were beginning to shift. He was talking about maybe quitting his job as pastor. He was seemed like on the path toward a divorce in his marriage, things that I didn't totally understand. And he came up one time to preach here at the gathering, and during that instance, he just acted totally different from how I had experienced him before. He didn't seem to take the day very seriously. He was nonchalant about the preaching. I thought that he came and didn't really give his best in that moment. It really was not only frustrating to me, but it really was disappointing to me. And I didn't understand what was going on. So I ended up confronting him about it. And I told him I was really disappointed. I feel like he kind of betrayed my trust. I invited him to come here and to preach, and he didn't take that moment very seriously. He was angry in return with me. Over several years, we ended up working through it. But the truth is that our relationship never really recovered. It never really was quite the same. And I share that because I bet all of you have had some instance where someone that you care about has disappointed you in a way where you can't easily get over it. Maybe it's somebody who has repeatedly over time just become a person that you don't quite recognize. Maybe it's somebody who has repeatedly let you down in a way that forced you to have to change the role that that person plays in your life. But I think all of us have probably had that experience of people letting us down in a way that alters our relationship with that person. And what I realized looking back is over time, what I had to do is I had to just finally accept that my friend was in a new place in life, and whatever our relationship used to look like, it was just going to look different in the future. And I couldn't really change it. I couldn't really control that. I just had to kind of accept that. And what we see in Jesus is something really similar. He deals with the behavior of Judas with this profound sense of acceptance. I mean, this acceptance is on display when Jesus identifies Judas and says this to him. Jesus told him, the scripture says, "What you are about to do, do it quickly." So when Judas took the bread, he left immediately, and it was night. And I'm struck by Jesus didn't lash out at him. He didn't accuse him in front of everybody else. He just accepted this is something this guy is going to do. If you're going to do it, then go and do it. When I say acceptance, by the way, I'm not talking about like just accepting that this behavior of another person is okay, or acceptance doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do or that Jesus could say or do in this situation. Acceptance means something more like understanding that we can't control what another person is going to do. I loved this definition of acceptance from someone in recovery. They said acceptance is taking people and things as they are and not as we wish they would be. Another person said acceptance is focusing on what's in your control. And so what I think Jesus shows us here is sometimes, even though we have hopes for how other people will act, we have expectations of them, we ultimately do not control other people. And there are certain times when we have to just finally accept that that person isn't who we want them to be. And maybe they never will be. I remember speaking with a woman years ago around the holidays, and she had a very challenging relationship with her mom. It was not a healthy relationship. Her mom had kind of repeatedly over time disappointed her. And I remember seeing her after the holidays and, how was it? And she said, man, I had a breakthrough finally this year. After 40 some odd years of the relationship with her mom, I said, what was the breakthrough? And she said, finally, after 40 years, I've just accepted that my mom is never going to be the mom that I wanted her to be. And that acceptance has kind of freed me to just see her for who she is and not who I want her to be, to focus on what she offers instead of all the ways in which she falls short. And I get it. Friends, sometimes our expectations of people in our life is never going to be met by that person. And no matter how much we try to talk or no matter how much we try to clarify expectations, that person is not going to be the person that we expect them to be. I have to imagine that in this moment, Jesus knew there was nothing that he was going to do to change Judas's mind. Judas had made this decision. And Jesus practiced this profound sense of acceptance, focusing on what he can control and letting go of that which he cannot. It reminds me of the prayer that it was written by a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr, but a lot of us know it from AA. It's called the Serenity Prayer. And it says, God, grant me this serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think that's acceptance. It's recognizing what we can control in another person and what we can't control. And the truth is, you can't make someone be someone that they are not. You can't repeatedly expect things of them that they're never going to deliver. If you do, you're in for just a string of disappointment. Sometimes the best way to deal with our disappointment is just to accept people. Letting go of those expectations that we have for them, drawing new boundaries if we need to draw new boundaries, which can be really important, recalibrating our relationship, but accepting that they aren't going to be that person that we want them to be. Acceptance is the second way that Jesus dealt with disappointment. I think it's a profound tool for us dealing with disappointment in our own life. And then finally, the final way in which Jesus was disappointed was by Peter choosing to deny him. And here we see Jesus offering us the third way to deal with disappointment, and that is finding a way to offer forgiveness to other people. I mean, Jesus kind of went through the ringer, by the way, at this Last Supper. Because as soon as Judas got up and left, the other disciples are saying, well, we would never do that to you, Jesus. And Peter tries to make the situation better by making a promise to Jesus that Jesus knows Peter can never fulfill. And so Jesus says this. He says, Simon, Simon, look, Satan has asserted the right to sift you all like wheat. That was a way of saying he's going to tempt all of you. However, I have prayed for you that your faith won't fail. When you have returned, strengthen your brothers and sisters. Peter responded, Lord, I'm ready to go with you, both to prison and to death. And Jesus replied, I tell you, Peter, the rooster won't crow today before you've denied me, denied 3 times that you even knew me. I mean, here was Peter, Jesus' best friend, closest disciple. I mean, you got to love Peter. He was trying, like he was making a promise to Jesus, but Jesus knew this was a promise Peter was not going to be able to keep. And it had to be something that Jesus desperately wanted from Peter. He wanted Peter to show up with him and to stand by his side until death, but he knew that he wouldn't. And later that night, Jesus' suspicion would come true. Not only did Peter desert him, but pretty much everybody deserted him. And Jesus was left alone and had to be left with this profound sense of disappointment. That even Peter and his other closest friends would leave him in the end. And yet, this would not be Peter's last chapter with Jesus. Just a few days later, after the resurrection, we see Jesus offer forgiveness to Peter, someone that he knew ultimately loved him, but who had really messed up. You know, John tells us the conversation they have after the resurrection. They were eating breakfast one morning by the sea, and it says when they had finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Simon replied, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, then feed my lambs. They went through this 3 different times where Peter reassured Jesus, I love you. And Jesus reassured Peter, you still have a role to play in this movement. I still love you too, and you are forgiven. And this is widely seen as Jesus forgiving not just Peter, but all those who ultimately had disappointed him in those final days. And you know, friends, the truth is, there's so much I could talk about when it comes to forgiveness. I've dedicated an entire series to this topic, so I'm not going to go in depth into this. But forgiveness is really at the heart of Jesus's last days and leading up to the cross. It's at the heart of what we're going to be reading about from now until Easter. Forgiveness, if I had to put a simple definition on it, it's a costly, God-empowered act of letting go of anger and offering grace to people that we love. It's about letting go of the anger and resentment and disappointment that we have towards other people and beginning to offer them a grace to be imperfect people. And you know what? It's rooted in what Jesus does for you and does for me. It's rooted in what Jesus did here for Peter. I mean, ultimately, the last days of Jesus' life would be one where everybody abandoned Jesus in one way or the other. In fact, as we read the story, I think part of what we're invited to see is that you have let Jesus down. I've let Jesus down. All of us have made promises to God that we haven't always been able to fulfill, or have not done what we promised we would do, or have said, oh God, we love you, but then have ignored God or neglected God in our everyday lives. All of us have fallen short. All of us have disappointed God. And over the next few weeks, what we see is even though we maybe have repeatedly disappointed God, God never has given up on us. In fact, Jesus, when he has every right to be upset with us, offers us this forgiveness and this second chance, third chance, fourth chance to do it all over again. And that gift has changed so many of us. And I think what we're being invited to see in this story is that what God in Jesus has given to us, maybe it's time that we begin to offer a little bit more of that to people in our own lives. And I think today that's where I want to close. Friends, ultimately, what the story of Jesus last week shows us is that you aren't perfect. I'm not perfect. And you know what? Other people in our life aren't perfect either. And sometimes those people who love you, that you love, they're going to disappoint you. And you know what? That disappointment is good for you to feel. It is an okay thing for you to feel. And when that disappointment happens, it's fair to let that person know about it, to let them know how they've hurt you, to clarify expectations. But what I want us to know is we don't want to stay in that place of disappointment. You don't want to live there. Because over time, disappointment can harden into something else in our hearts: anger, resentment, just a sense of not being able to trust or wanting to trust anyone else in our lives. And ultimately, it can hurt us. And so this forgiveness is ultimately a gift for you. It's a gift for me. It's the gift of letting go of anger and resentment, of accepting in some ways that people aren't going to be perfect, for offering in the ways that we can some grace to other people, the same grace that Jesus gives to us. And so, as we approach these last weeks, that's what I want you to think about: the ways in which God has forgiven you, the ways in which God has dealt with you when you've repeatedly disappointed others. And maybe today, maybe this week, maybe in the coming weeks, it could be a time when we're able to shift or transform some of that disappointment and hurt that we've felt because of someone else into a sort of grace that we can give to that other person. Even if it means that we need to draw new boundaries in our relationship, a sort of grace for them to be imperfect just as we are imperfect. Doing that, I think, can really free us. It can free us from staying in that place of disappointment, ultimately anger and distrust. And so, as we close today, I want to close with the full serenity prayer. A lot of you just know that line that I read, but there's a full prayer. And I want you to listen to the themes of controlling what we can control, accepting the things that we can't control, understanding that not everything is always going to be as we expect it to be. You're going to feel disappointment, but it's not a place that you have to stay. Let's pray together. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. Taking, as Jesus did, the sinful world as it is and not as I would have it. Trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever. Amen.